Well, today we began a new series on David, and we're going to explore why the significance of this person is so important in our faith. David is a foundational figure both in Judaism and in Christianity, and if you look at the Bible in the Old Testament, you see that David's name is mentioned more than 1,000 times, more than Moses, more than Abraham. Half the Psalms were ascribed to David, and he is truly an important figure. He was a shepherd, he was a warrior, he was a king, and he was a poet. And he was a prophet to a certain extent, and we need to understand what his life was because, in fact, we reflect David's life, and David's life reflects our own lives. And I think sometimes people are so fascinated by David, and really throughout history, because if you take a look at him, you see what we hope to be. At his best, he was a man who sought after God's own heart, someone who God loved. And even his name, in fact, means beloved, because he was so loved by God, and he was so loved by many others. But we also look at this story, and we see that he was also kind of a mess sometimes. He was power hungry. There were times when he abused his power. And there were many things that we look at David and say, I don't want to be like that. But we also recognize that we are, in fact, some ways just like that. All of us undergo messes at various times in our lives, and we need to figure out ways to let go of that mess and be the beloved of God that David was to the Holy One. So together, let's explore his story. And we're going to begin in Bethlehem. And we're going to start where David began as a shepherd. And the location of Bethlehem for David's life really goes back about 2 generations before that to his great-grandmother. And it goes all the way back to Ruth. And you remember we talked about Ruth last week if you were here. And Ruth is known in Jewish tradition as the prototypic Jew by choice, the one who chose to believe in one God. And she said, "Your people shall be my people, your God, my God." She was considered such a model of piety and virtue that her great-grandson would become what some would say the greatest king that Israel had ever known, King David. Well, today, if you travel through Bethlehem, the things that you see for Christians who come, there is one central point that you come to, and that is the Church of the Nativity. And it is called the Manger Square. And some of you may have seen this place before. This is the place where Jesus has said to have been born in a cave, in a stable, in fact. But if you travel throughout this land, you'll find shepherds' fields, and you'll find the fields of Ruth and Boaz, and you'll find all these stories that are important to our faith. So, that is a tiny glimpse of Bethlehem. But what we're going to do is go outside of Bethlehem this morning, and Pastor Adam Hamilton, who has traveled to Bethlehem many times, had an opportunity to actually travel there outside of Bethlehem and meet a shepherd by the name of Omar. And he shared that Omar had been a shepherd since he was about 6 years old. And at the age of 7, he was left by his family out in the wilderness with the sheep. And he was forced to go all the way back home by himself. So hearing about Omar's life as a shepherd gives us some insight to what David's life as a shepherd boy was like. So Omar, he lives in this wilderness of Judea where the Bedouin graze their sheep. And Omar shares that the main thing for them when they go into this wilderness is to actually feed the sheep. So he looks for places where there are grasses growing. Every day, they travel around the wilderness looking for areas where they can find plants. And when the sheep run out of places to eat, they simply wander around and search again for more food. And Omar says finding water is one of the main ways that shepherds care for their sheep. If they don't find any water, they have to return all the way home, even if it's before noon, because if they don't get enough water, they become sick and they die. The shepherds also depend on dogs to protect their sheep. And also, they need to take care of these dogs as well. And if they see a wolf or a fox or another predator, the shepherds shout. And as soon as they begin shouting, the dogs begin attacking the predators. The dogs won't allow any strangers or animals to be between them and the sheep. And Omar went on to say that the sheep, well, they know him, and they know his voice. And as soon as they hear his voice, they come to him as fast as they can. Omar said that the main way to direct the sheep is his voice, but he also has a rod, which he uses to make them afraid, to feel fear if they begin wandering outside the flock. And he also uses it to kill snakes if he sees them, or to defend himself against any other animals that want to attack. So Omar also will protect the sheep that appear very tired and might fall behind, so they don't fall victim to the other animals. Omar describes being a good shepherd as this: the good shepherd is someone who stays at all times with his sheep and doesn't leave them, to be patient and walk with them slowly so they don't tire, and to be sure to keep an eye on them, providing water at the right time. He says it isn't for everyone. It's a very hard life. You need a deep desire and love of taking care of the sheep, which in turn leads to a successful and happy flock. Well, this lifestyle was the lifestyle of most of the prophets of the Old Testament, prophets such as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David. And the shepherds of now are followers of what the shepherds of old taught. And when you think about the shepherd's life, you can't help but think about David in the 23rd Psalm. You feel this sense of peace as you imagine David out there actually composing these words. So in the rabbinical and Jewish tradition, as well as Christianity, the 23rd Psalm is foundational. In Jewish and Christian tradition, it is part of the liturgy that is read when somebody passes away, because there is a sense of comfort that is received, knowing that God is with us in our times of need and struggle. And when we talk about walking in the valley of the shadow of death, literally, there are times when that happens. But there are other times as well when we walk in that valley of the shadow and we struggle with life, when things aren't going exactly the way we want them to go, and we need help. And that's when we turn to God, who is both our shepherd and our Savior. And you know, all of us, we all have the ability to be shepherds, just like David was. And I think that's the external message that is within this 23rd Psalm, that each of us has that ability. Let me tell you a story about a woman I personally know very, very well. She had breast cancer. And through virtually all of her treatment, she had nobody there sitting beside her. And when she finished her treatment, I remember that she went to go out and buy a bra. And again, there was nobody there with her. It was one of the loneliest moments in her life. And so for the next several years, she made the decision that every single time she heard of a woman who had breast cancer, she would go out and volunteer to go with them to buy their first bra as a way of supporting them. You know, friends, each of us in life need to be that kind of shepherd. We need to shepherd our friends and our family and even strangers that we meet. And so God was choosing David because he had the ability to care for the vulnerable and the weak. And we heard what Omar was saying about what a shepherd does for his sheep. And I love that image that all of us are called to be shepherds for others. We are called to be like David and care for other people. That's why David was called to care for Israel. So as I think about this story, of course, we have Samuel is told by God that God is going to choose this new king, and that God has taken favor away from King Saul, and he says, I want you to go to the house of Jesse, who was a shepherd in Bethlehem. And God says, I want you to find one of his sons, one of Jesse's sons, who will be chosen to be the next king of Israel. So Samuel does show up at Jesse's house, and he says, one of your sons is going to be the next king. Bring him to me. And you heard it. Jesse brings his oldest son, and Samuel looks at him and says, yeah, he's the one. He's strapping and strong and handsome and smart and tall. And God says, nope, it's not the one. He's not the one. And so Samuel says, well, do you have another son? And so Jesse brings his second oldest son. And God says, no, that one's not the one either. And both times Samuel looks at him and said, yeah, this must be the one. And God says, no, that's not the one. And the third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh, and finally he's out of sons. And Samuel says, well, surely you have another son. And Jesse says, well, yeah, there's the youngest, the child. He's out there caring for the sheep. He doesn't even have a name. And Samuel says, well, go get him and bring him in. And so Jesse brings him in, and God looks at him and said, yes, he's the one. And I love this line. It says, you look at the outward appearance. Humans look at outward appearance, but I look at the heart. And God had chosen David to be the next king of Israel. Now, of course, it would be years before he would actually be anointed as king, but I love this picture. And part of what this story speaks to us, I think, is about how God chooses the unlikely. It's God choosing the ordinary, the ones with the least likely image to succeed. And we see that consistently in the Bible. And we see that starting with Abraham, who with Sarah are an elderly couple who can't have children. And God says, out of you will come a nation who will be a blessing to all the nations of earth. And God saw it in Moses. Moses was a stutterer. He couldn't speak clearly, and yet he was challenged to go before Pharaoh and free the children of Israel. Throughout history, we have examples of the one who's least likely, who arises to become the one who is truly our hero. I recall a story when I was younger. I remember an elderly man who walked up to our house, and he came to our door, and he was walking with a walker. And I remember my dad and we both went to the door, and this man just said, I just wanted to invite you to church. And I have to tell you, that made a huge, huge impact on me. Huge. The fact that he walked all the way down the street with his walker, going from house to house just to invite people to church. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I am very passionate about outreach, because this gentleman went door to door with a disability to invite people to church. And God used him in such a profound way. And there are lots and lots of stories here in this congregation and in this community and elsewhere where these stories can be found. We talked a couple years ago, maybe you might remember, about a young boy named Jeff Hansen who had a tumor on his optical nerve, and he was legally blind. And his parents said, we believe that God is going to use our son in a profound way. And he has the gift for creating art. And today, while Jeff is in his late 20s, and he is known around the world for his art, and he has given away over $4 million, and his goal is to give away more than $10 million by the time he is 30 years old. When other people may have dismissed him saying, what's going to become of this kid? Instead, his parents and his faith and God working through him took something that was most ordinary and unlikely and did something so amazing that his story has been told around the world. So this is the idea that God takes the ordinary, whatever gifts and experiences that you have, you may feel like you have nothing to offer even, and God says, no, I can use you to do some amazing and dramatic things if you'll just let me. And that's in part the story of David being chosen by God to shepherd God's people. Each of us has this ability to be just like that, to be the David, the shepherd, the one who cares for the ones who need caring for, the one who's least likely to care, the one who didn't have a name. I mean, David didn't originally have a name, but we know that David's name means beloved. And each of us can be beloved to others and to God if we only consider what we can do for them. So let's strive to do that each day in our lives. God takes the ordinary and does the extraordinary with it, and that's what we're called to remember. We can stand back in awe at what God did with David, and that's what God does with us. God allows us, who consider ourselves ordinary, to do extraordinary work each and every day of our lives. All we need to do is trust in God, and God will be there to support us and to enable us to do those great things just as David did with his life. And now I feel somehow compelled that we should recite the 23rd Psalm together here this morning. But as we do so, I want you to take a look at this picture. This is an image of the valley of the shadow of death. You know, we all walk in this valley of the shadow of death sometimes. And we say that for comfort because we believe that God will protect us, that God will watch over us. God will set a table before us in the presence of our enemies. And the other thing is, our enemies are not always other people. They are not always real. Sometimes they're internal. They are our emotional enemies. And the 23rd Psalm is one of those pivotal pieces of literature in our world that offers comfort and inspiration at the same time. So let's pray this together. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.